I just want to open this video by saying that I have a lot of things to be thankful for in my life. But more than anything else, I'm thankful that this book was not my first introduction to Star Trek. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 1 of my brand new series, Star Trek Book Club, where I am going to be reading old Star Trek novels and then discussing and reviewing them. When I was a kid, Star Trek The Next Generation was on the air and I was a huge fan. I watched and rewatched every episode as they came on TV. I just could not get enough. And then one day I discovered the Star Trek The Next Generation novel series on the book rack in the corner of my local convenience store. I was beyond excited to have more content to consume. This was, after all, before the days of household internet use, and I could not just go online to get my Star Trek fix like I can now. I ate those novels up when I was young. I thought they were great. But now, decades later, I'm in my 40s, and I find myself asking the question, were they actually any good? Are they worth a reread after all this time? Well, the copies of those books that I bought when I was a kid are long gone now, so I've taken to the task of traveling to flea markets and used bookstores to recollect the entire series. And now that my collection is almost complete, I feel like it's time for me to start sharing the experience of rereading them with you, the viewer. Probably singular you, the viewer, to start out with. And naturally, as a die-hard Next Generation fan, I'm going to start out with the Next Generation novels, more specifically, Book 1, Ghost Ship. Ghost Ship was written by author Diane Carey and was published in 1988. Diane Carey got her start writing historical romance novels, something that bleeds into this book a little bit at times, before moving on to write Star Trek books full-time. She wrote 2 original series novels, Dreadnought and Battle Stations, before being invited to write the pilot novel for the Star Trek The Next Generation series. Her Star Trek novels are widely regarded as being written in English and printed on paper. The novel opens in 1995 on a Soviet aircraft carrier as the Soviet Navy prepares to test a new superweapon. What's that, you say? The Soviet Union didn't exist in 1995? Well, that's true. I looked it up. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But I'm going to give the author a break on getting this historical fact wrong, since the book was published before the fall of the Soviet Union, and in my research that I did on Diane Carey, I saw no indication that she was able to read the future. What I will not give the author a break on, however, is having the entire 17-page first chapter take place in 1995 Russia, following a Soviet captain and his first officer. It actually had me checking to make sure that I wasn't somehow reading the wrong book. I suspected that perhaps somebody had chopped a Tom Clancy novel in half and glued it inside of the cover of a Star Trek book. So a couple of pages in, I flipped to the start of chapter 2 just to check. I'm not a big Tom Clancy fan, and I wasn't really interested in being duped into reading half of one of his books. And the first words of chapter 2 are, fire phasers. I think we're good. Not a lot of phaser fire in the Tom Clancy universe. So the Soviets are testing their new superweapon when suddenly a wall of energy appears, destroys the ship, and causes the entire crew to mysteriously disappear. So then, fast forward 370-ish years, and Counselor Troi is in bed, having psychic nightmares about the crew of a Russian ship, while the rest of the Enterprise conducts tests on a gas giant. And of course, the first chapter ends with a description of Troy's ivory skin, black hair, and sweat rolling down between her breasts, as though someone had dumped a beaker of glycerin over her shoulders. Solid ending to the first chapter. So after a panicked visit to the bridge, Troi returns to her quarters to try and figure out what she's been seeing with her Betazoid powers. Riker follows her back and awkwardly tries to reassure her or something. And then as he's leaving, Riker sees a ghost in the hallway and just assumes it's a hologram. Later, Troi returns to the bridge and describes being able to sense the presence of millions of souls, including the 2 dead Russians from her dream. At the same time, energy blips are showing up all over the ship, to the great frustration of Yar and Worf. Geordi starts to see ghosts wandering around the bridge, which is a thing his visor can do now, and he's able to put that image up on the screen, which is also a thing he can do. Upon seeing this, Wesley Crusher declares the ship haunted. Ooh. Of course, stern, no-nonsense Captain Picard demands to open communication with the ghosts. Ship's sensors pick up something at the edge of their range, and it turns out to be the same wall of energy thing that destroyed the Soviet ship back in 1995. They fire at it, and it has no effect. If anything, the energy wall kinda seems to like it a little bit. It starts chasing them at warp 14.9. Troy pleads with Picard not to let them in, but the energy wall envelops the ship anyways and starts draining the power from the ship and possesses Data. Data spits out a vague cryptic message before the thing eventually releases him and they make their escape. While attempting to hide from it, they discover that this entity is attracted to energy, and in a desperate attempt to escape, they make the bold decision to separate the saucer section, and then they use the star drive section to try and distract the thing, while all the important people on the sausage In a bold act of desperation, they decide to separate the saucer section from the star drive section and use the star drive section to distract the entity while the saucer section escapes. They decide to ram into the thing, at which point it starts to communicate with Troy and Data again. Troy relays the message, "You can end it," while Data becomes frustrated that he is not able to transmit a message back to the thing. Picard makes the only sensible decision you can in a situation like this. He ejects the antimatter core and blows it up in front of the ship to try and distract the thing away from the saucer section. They play a bit of cat and mouse as the Enterprise tries to hide from the energy wall, and in the process, Troy discovers that this is actually a collection of not quite yet dead souls trapped in an abyss begging to be killed. This leads to an ethical debate about whether or not it is right to kill the ghosts on this ship, who are separated from their bodies and being tortured for an eternity in an isolated state of sensory deprivation where they're all being slowly driven mad and have no hope of escape and are quite literally begging for it to end. From what I gather, the only reason there's a debate at all is because they didn't technically die. Their consciousnesses were ripped from their bodies, and then their bodies were destroyed. The senior crew of the Enterprise all seem weirdly reluctant to kill these ghosts that are, let's face it, already dead. So naturally, Captain Picard decides to take the only sane and obvious course of action in this time-sensitive situation where they're being pursued by an entity that rips the consciousness from human beings and then feeds off of energy. He decides to go into a sensory deprivation tank so he can better empathize with their suffering. For 16 hours. Well, 14 hours in the tank and another 2 hours to eventually wake him up. This is literally how the central dilemma of the story is resolved, by the captain of the Enterprise going into a deprivation tank and thinking about it for 16 hours while his crew is being hunted by an entity that wants to destroy them. But then, after his 16 hours in the sensory deprivation tank, he wakes up and is like, well, that sucked, let's kill them, I guess. Now, that's not all that happens, of course. While Picard is hiding in a sensory deprivation tank for 16 hours, Data steals a shuttlecraft because he's so depressed from Riker bullying him for the entire novel about being an android, and he wants to see if he's actually alive enough that the entity will try to eat him. And that's a sentence no one should ever have to say out loud. What's happening in this novel is just wild. Luckily, though, Riker feels bad enough about being a dick, so he takes another shuttle to go try and bring Data back and rescues him at the last second. There's also a Wesley Ex Machina subplot where Geordi discovers that Wesley has invented a new way to boost the phasers, and he's been experimenting with it by tapping directly into the ship's reserve antimatter tanks, something that could destroy the entire ship if he makes even one little mistake. This is going to come in handy later, obviously. So in the end, Picard decides that being trapped in a void is indeed unpleasant, and he decides to grant the trapped soul's request to be released from their torment. But this entity feeds on energy, so the Enterprise phasers would be useless against it. They need super phasers. They need Wesley phasers. So they destroy the entity, Troy stops hearing voices, Wesley learns a valuable lesson in practicing safe phaser experiments, and Data decides that he must be alive after all because he was briefly killed by the entity. So what's the verdict? Was this a good Star Trek novel? Was it worth going back and reading after all? And you know what? Yes. As far as a sci-fi novel goes, it was actually pretty good. Sure, I poked some fun at it while describing the plot, but I challenge you to go back and find some 90s-era science fiction that wasn't kind of ridiculous. It has some good sci-fi elements and a moral dilemma to overcome, albeit a bit ham-fistedly. But if ham-fistedly tackling a moral or ethical dilemma isn't Star Trek, then I don't know what is. Am I right? The author even did a pretty good job of tying subplots into the main story. The question of if the ghosts on the enemy ship were actually alive was mirrored by the question of whether Data was actually alive. The question of if the ghosts on the enemy ship were actually alive and if it was right to kill them was mirrored by Data's quest to discover if he was actually alive or if he was just a tool on a starship. There were a couple aspects of Ghost Ship that bothered me though. First, the opening chapter was out of place and unnecessary. The rest of the book would not be changed in the slightest bit if we didn't have the backstory of the crew from the Soviet aircraft carrier. I kept expecting that backstory to pay off at some point, for Captain Rakoff or his first officer to become a point of contact for the crew of the Enterprise, or for their suffering to somehow stand out and become relevant to the discussion. But it just never happened, and I felt myself wondering why I needed to know any of that. I actually briefly thought that this opening chapter... I actually briefly thought that this opening chapter might be a reflection of the author's history of writing historical novels. But then I realized that since this book was written in 1988, 1995 was the future at that point, and not really history. The other thing that bothered me a lot more than an unnecessary first chapter to the book was the personalities and portrayal of the crew of the Enterprise. So buckle up, I'm about to do some complaining. Now, before I launch into a rant about how bad the characters in this book are, I need to defend the author to some degree. My understanding is that this book was written before Season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation aired, and this book was planned out in its entirety before any episodes had aired, most of them were even written, and before some of the casting was even finished. So Diane Carey had to write this novel with only the show Bible and the TNG Writer's Guide to go off of. So naturally, some of the characterizations didn't make the final cut of the show. So it's somewhat understandable that the characters would act differently in this novel than they ended up being in the finished TV show. I mean, even within the show itself, most of the characters don't finish the series with the same personalities that they started the series out with. They all evolved over the 7-year run. So I'm going to start out with the characterizations that weren't actually that bad, and work my way up to the one that was so bad that it almost made me stop reading the book entirely. So we'll start with Worf. He was maybe a little more gruff than he was in the TV show, but he's barely in this novel and has little to no impact on the plot, so it's kind of difficult to find any real issues with his characterization. And Dr. Crusher was also not in the novel a lot, although when she was, it was at the end of the book during the debate on whether or not to end the suffering of the ghosts that had died centuries earlier, so she did have some impact on the plot. And overall, she comes across as being very similar to the Dr. Crusher that we see in the show. She's a strong, intelligent character who doesn't back down when pushed and comes across as compassionate and personable in her interactions with the rest of the crew. When it came to the topic of medical ethics, an area of expertise of hers being the chief medical officer on the ship, she was confident and stood up to Riker when he tried to bully her on the issue. More about Riker bullying people later. Troy is another character who was written fairly well in this book and who matched up well with her TV series counterpart. I actually read a review that somebody else wrote about Ghost Ship, And they pointed out in their review that the only real difference between Troy of the novel and Troy of the TV show is that Troy in the novel actually had an impact on the plot. Funny, but true. Troy is probably the character who I think evolved the most over the course of the 7 seasons of the show. And in the book, what we get is more in line with season 1 and 2 Troy rather than season 7 Troy, which makes perfect sense given when the book was written and when it was set to take place. My only big issue with Troy in the book was her relationship with Riker. Not because I think it was out of place, it was actually treated very similarly to how it was treated in the early seasons of the show. But it led to a few things that I hated so much, and even led to one line that led me to just laugh out loud because it was so ridiculous. First of all, she keeps calling Riker Bill, and I have a hard time putting into words just how much I don't like that. My first thought when she started calling him that was, please stop. His name is Will, not Bill. She calls him Will in the show. Please stop it. I hate it so much. Stop making it weird. But later, something happened. When I was rewatching season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation to get myself in the headspace to make these videos, I noticed something odd. In The Naked Now, the second episode of season 1, Deanna calls Will Bill. I'd never noticed that before, but I guess after being so put off by reading it over and over in this book, it must have stood out to me now. So I watched the rest of the season, listening very carefully to see if this was a thing that happened a lot and I just missed. So I watched the rest of the season, listening very carefully to see if it happened again. And it did. In episode 11, Haven, Deanna calls Will Riker Bill when they're on the holodeck with her fiancé. My worldview was shaken. Could this thing that I hated so much in this novel have been a recurring thing in the TV show this whole time and I just didn't notice? And then my memory started working a bit. It's rare, but it does that sometimes. I had seen this Bill stuff before somewhere. And then I figured it out. It was the Star Trek The Next Generation companion. Luckily, I have a copy. So I looked it up. Well, actually I have 2 copies because I forgot that I had it and then I rebought it. Like I said, my memory doesn't always work. And on page 15 of the Star Trek Companion, it says, Riker is privately called William by Picard and Bill by female friends. So now I'm wondering if I was too harsh on my judgment of the author over this. Riker being called Bill by female friends was originally supposed to be a thing in the series. But I am so glad they dropped that, even if it did sneak in twice. And can you imagine if Picard called Riker William? Like, think about that. As you were, William. Yeah, I don't like that at all. Anyways, back to what I consider the worst line in the book. Maybe the worst line ever written. You see all these tabs? Most of the blue ones are times that the author made a weird point of describing someone's hair in detail for no reason. The greenish-yellowish ones are plot points that I wanted to remember and go back to later. And see this red one? Yeah, that's the line. When I was reading it, I couldn't help but go grab a red post-it note, write "Oh, come on" it, and stick it to the offending page. It all happens over the course of a conversation between Crusher and Troy. During the debate on whether or not to kill the ghosts and end their suffering, Troy becomes overwhelmed by the entire thing, and Dr. Crusher pulls her aside to have a conversation and try and calm her down. Deanna tells Crusher that she's very disappointed that Riker didn't back her up when she was telling the captain about what she felt about the ghosts and what the ghosts wanted. You see, her and Riker had known each other for 5 years, practically an eternity, and she felt that the two should have been more in sync than that. But instead, Riker completely dismissed her opinion that the ghosts were actually suffering. The conversation leads to a discussion on Troy and Riker's past relationship, and Crusher asks Troy why she calls him Bill when the rest of the crew calls him Will. Now, the only way to do justice to what happens next is by reading it straight out of the book, so that's what I'm going to do. Why do you call him Bill when everyone else calls him Will? Troy's cheeks flushed and she managed to smile. I didn't know it was so obvious. It's not. I'm just astonishingly observant, you know. Troy's delicate smile widened. Bill sounds like a word in the language of Beta Z. A word I like. Reminds me of my childhood there. There's no translation, but it had to do with... Oh, I shouldn't tell you. I wouldn't want to compromise him. Go ahead, the doctor said, a mischievous gleam in her eyes. Compromise him. Well, it means... Yes? Shaving cream. Yeah, shaving cream. More specifically, a brand of evergreen scented shaving cream that Troy's dad used to use when she was a kid. So yeah, Troy and Riker's relationship is all linked back to memories of her father. So Crusher continues by saying, "Oh, that explains it," Crusher said. "Latent childhood impressions of parental evergreenery. There you are. It's not Riker who attracts you. It's pine trees. And I think I'm only a fair psychologist. Move over, Deanna. I think I like this. Wait till Wesley hears about it. Shaving cream Riker." Why does this paragraph exist? It doesn't need to exist. Bill is a very common way to shorten the name William. I don't need this creepy and unnecessary backstory about why someone calls someone named William Bill. It's just unnecessary. Why? Yeah, I just need to sit in silence and regroup for a few hours now. Okay, I'm back. So, remember a couple seconds ago when I said I needed to regroup for a couple hours? That was over a month ago for me. You see, I was being dramatic. I wanted to go to bed, I needed to get some sleep, so I figured I'd finish making the video in the morning, and I wanted an excuse just in case things looked different one cut to the next. Well, we ended up getting hit by a huge ice storm, and power was knocked out for a couple days, lost internet for over a week, cleanup is still going on, there was trees down everywhere, and I didn't get around to actually coming back and finishing this video till now, over a month later. So some of this is no longer super fresh in my head, so I'm going to quickly go over a few of the characters to get to the one that I really wanted to talk about. So Picard. Picard just feels wrong in this novel. It's hard to pinpoint specific lines and examples, he just feels kind of cold and angry, and almost seems to resent his crew, especially his blind pilot and his overly emotional counselor. He's rigid and he's strict, and he has no time to wait for answers. He needs everything right now. Picard was actually one of my role models growing up, something that likely would not have been the case if this was the version of Picard we had gotten in the show. So Tasha Yar. Like many of the characters in this novel, Tasha Yar was not as confident or as... What you doing, Doug? Don't play with my cords, Doug. Nope, Doug. Tasha Yar. So like many of the characters in this book, she was not quite as confident and capable as she was in her brief stint in the show. She's also Lithuanian in the book. I'm guessing this is because the author assumed that Lithuanians could read and understand Russian, and she needed someone to understand Russian because of the unnecessary backstory from Chapter 1. She could have just made her Russian, I guess, but she didn't. Geordi. Geordi exists mostly to be Data's friend and to defend him when his superior officers insult him in front of the rest of the crew. He also exists to see things that other people can't while complaining about how much it sucks to have a visor. There are some passing mentions in the TV show about Geordi feeling discomfort when using his visor, but it isn't the central focus. In Ghost Ship, however, feeling pain while using his visor is the bulk of Geordi's personality. And the last of the characters that I can still tolerate, Data. The Data that we get in Ghost Ship is much less competent than the version we get in the TV show, and much like the rest of the crew, he spends most of his time second-guessing himself. He regularly ignores whatever important task he's supposed to be focusing on to monologue about the meaning of life and whether or not he's alive. He also takes a joke that worked pretty well over a short period of time in the show and drags it on for way too long. He does the whole Data trying to speak in human slang bit that he did for short periods in a couple episodes, and continues it for a solid third of the book. It gets old about as fast as you think it would. Data kind of feels like an unfinished version of the final character. There just isn't a whole lot of depth there. And now, Riker. The character of Will Riker is the one that is by far done the greatest injustice by Diane Carey. I'm not going to pretend I'm not biased here. I'm a huge Will Riker fan. I probably have more Will Riker stuff than anything else in my collection. At any given moment, he's staring at me from almost every direction while I sit at my desk. But what Diane Carey does to William T. Riker in Ghost Ship is nothing short of a slap in the face. Riker comes across as a bully. It's one thing for him to harbor this deep animosity towards Data that borders on hatred, but he continuously brings it up in front of the rest of the crew. At one point, while Data is admittedly being kind of annoying, Riker lashes out at him, saying, "You're never going to be human." Riker ground out, "You're not human. You don't seem to get the difference between being human and mimicking humans. You can't be creative because you only see the affectation and none of the substance. You're missing life. Until you learn the difference, you'll always be a puppet." "Sir," Geordi appeared beside them. "He's only trying to—" "I know what he's trying to do," Riker snapped. They were all silent for a moment. A look of deep injury crossed Data's face, and he glanced at Geordi, then back to Riker. I am only attempting to improve myself. To serve the best—" "Then serve," Riker blurted out. "Put yourself to use in your true capacity. You're an android. Use that to its best advantage and quit trying to be something you're not. Give us something to work with if you can provide something for me to take back to the captain that'll help us out of this." He took a step even closer, an intimidating step that backed Data tighter against the panel. "If that entity strikes again, I want you to give in to it. See if you can interface with it." Data's pale brows drew tight over his nose, raised slightly in a delicate expression. Proof, at least to Geordi, that somewhere under the voltage there were feelings that could be hurt. In a near whisper, he responded, "I promise to try, sir." Riker then goes on to very strongly imply that he considers Data expendable and he would not hesitate to sacrifice him, and that the rest of the crew knows this about Riker. Riker is second in command of the ship. Acting this way to one of your crew members is completely out of line. He also comes across as a bit of a creep towards female crew members. I'll ignore the way he acts around Troy and the fact that he's kind of obsessed with her, because they do have a backstory and a past relationship, even though it does come across as a bit weird in this book sometimes. But there is an interaction with Lieutenant Yar that just comes across as weird and wrong. The setup here is that Yar made a suggestion, and not a bad one either, that just happened to not work out the way everyone expected. She didn't do anything wrong necessarily, but she still feels the need to ask Riker if she should apologize to the captain for it. Seriously, the levels of insecurity that the senior crew of the Enterprise have in this book is just shocking. "Sir, it was my idea to separate the sections." Tasha paused, waiting to catch his attention again. When she did, she tightened her thin, narrow lips and asked, "Should I apologize to the captain?" Riker dropped himself into the wishing well of those eyes, just for a moment. Sorry, I can't even read this with a straight face. Her eyes were enhanced with a simple stroke of eyeliner and a touch of mascara, not very much, as though she were unsure and self-conscious about her femininity. Riker found himself fascinated by those thin brown lines, now slightly smudged and a tad uneven. Tasha Yar was all good intentions in one package. Had Riker not reviewed the personnel files of the bridge officers when he got the assignment, he'd have taken one look into those eyes and at the supple, slim body under them, and reassigned her to teaching kindergarten to all the children of the Enterprise, who would brighten to see her face each day. He felt that way right now, like she was the child and he was the teacher. There was nothing in her face, in her eyes, to remind him of her upbringing on a pathetic excuse for a colony, yet he thought of it. He goes on like this in his head for a couple pages, and all I can picture is him just silently staring at her with this hungry look in his eyes while she quietly waits for him to answer her question. And as if being a bully who is regularly inappropriate with his subordinates isn't enough, Riker is also extremely unsure of himself. He mentally questions his own decisions and actions. He wishes he could be cool and decisive like Captain Picard. He seems bitter about his role as first officer and lacks anything that even comes close to being self-confidence. At times, he is unable to do something as simple as walk across the bridge without being paralyzed by indecision over what he should do with his body in the process. Early in the book, Picard even calls him out for it, asking if he's okay when he just gets stuck overanalyzing how he should move while pacing across the bridge. But in the end, Riker redeems himself, I guess? He saves Data from the entity and briefly apologizes for treating him like an expendable tool and driving him to risk his own destruction just to try and prove he's alive. You're a real hero, Bill. So I want to close out this video by circling back to what I said in the beginning. That I was happy that this book was not my first introduction to Star Trek. And it could have been, given my habit of grabbing random science fiction books off of bookstore bookshelves. I didn't say that because I think this was a terrible book that would have turned me off of Star Trek forever. It wasn't. Like I said earlier, it was a perfectly good science fiction novel. It had its flaws, but it was fine. I'm just glad that the characters as presented in this book were not the first impression I got of the Star Trek The Next Generation characters that I came to love. Will Riker is one of my all-time favorite characters. And if the bully filled with self-doubt was how I was first introduced to him, it might have colored how I saw him a little differently. Same goes for Picard and Data. First impressions can mean a lot with characters in a story, and this just wasn't a good one. Well, that's it for Ghost Ship. If you liked this video, feel free to subscribe. Next video, I'll be talking about Peacekeepers, Book 2 in the Star Trek The Next Generation novel series. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.